Introduction: The Long Fight Ahead. Real Peace, Not Pax Americana. Why the fuss? That was the apparent reaction of Biden, Blinken, and the D.C. war planners to worldwide horrified reactions at Israel's U.S.-backed genocidal slaughter in Gaza. As pressure built at the UN Security Council in late December 2023 to avoid a U.S. veto of another resolution to stop the bombing in Gaza, Blinken criticized nations calling for a ceasefire. He said he hears almost no calls for Hamas to lay down its arms and surrender, adding, "How can it be that there are no demands made of the aggressor and only demands made of the victim?" Instead of surrendering, Hamas has held off an Israeli land invasion of Gaza. The consequences of justifying genocide are difficult to calculate in the midst of the operation itself. How many Palestinians will be killed? How many homes, hospitals, and schools will be destroyed? Will there be anything or anyone left in Gaza? Will Israel's goal of crushing Hamas be realized? How is this operation different from earlier attacks on Gaza or the constant attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank now and in recent decades? What is the goal for Israel and its backer, the United States? And the results? For Blinken and his boss, the Gaza conflict began October 7th, when Palestinian forces broke through the apartheid wall caging them in and staged an unprovoked attack in which a reported 1,200 Israelis died. Overlooked is the fact that Israeli forces have made repeated bombing attacks on Gaza almost every other year since 2008. So are Israeli admissions that friendly fire caused the majority of Israeli deaths on October 7th, and the subsequent fighting, according to the largest daily English-language Israeli news source, Ynet, ynetnews.com. Israeli Air Force Colonel Naf Erez admitted on a Haaretz podcast, later reported in Electronic Intifada, that October 7th was a mass Hannibal event. Hannibal is a code name for Israel's policy of firing to kill hostages and enemy fighters rather than allow the enemy to take hostages. The homes of settlers in the kibbutz Be'eri were blown up even when occupied by Israelis, if the IDF suspected Palestinians might be inside, the report said. For Blinken and Biden, Israel was the victim, despite subjecting Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank to decades of constant intense repression and bombing as part of its refusal to allow for an independent Palestinian state. Switching victim and oppressor. Switching victim and aggressor is a favorite U.S. tactic for justifying slaughter in efforts to maintain domination. Back in 1964, it was a Vietnamese attack on a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin that justified what U.S. Air Force General Curtis LeMay called bombing them back to the Stone Age. Years earlier, the U.S. Air Force bombed and destroyed all the cities and most towns in northern Korea rather than allow Korea's revolutionary leadership to take over the country after the Japanese colonialists were defeated at the end of World War II. This carpet bombing was also a warning to China's post-1949 revolutionary leadership. But it backfired as 500,000 Chinese forces helped the Koreans push back the invaders at the 38th parallel and force an armed truce that continues today. General LeMay admitted the U.S. killed about 20% of the North Korean population during that war. And in 2017, then-President Trump threatened to totally destroy North Korea. The U.S. has done that before, he said. It's a reminder of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the U.S. used nuclear bombs against Japan after Japan was on the brink of surrender. That was a warning to the Soviet Union, which had already defeated Germany and was poised to complete the defeat of Japan. It became the basis of a balance of terror between the U.S. and the USSR that lasted until the Soviet collapse in late 1991. For U.S. war planners, the Cold War's end was not enough. It would have been a disaster for the military-industrial complex if its annual bonanza of military profits were ended for lack of enemies. So U.S. war planners like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Paul Wolfowitz crafted elaborate plans for a new world order with the U.S. über alles, maintaining control of the oil-rich Middle East, really Western Asia, and aspiring to control the world island, especially the Eurasian landmass, would facilitate long-term U.S. hegemony. Multiple aggressive U.S. and NATO military interventions followed the Soviet collapse. In Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. Millions of people died, and millions more became refugees. The 1999 NATO bombing attacks against the former Yugoslavia destroyed the last vestiges of a socialist country in Europe. Following the events of 9/11/2001, the U.S. declared endless war against terrorism, falsely claiming it was the victim of both Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. forces achieved little but slaughter and enormous profits. In 2011, the U.S. and NATO launched attacks against Libya, the richest country in Africa at that time. They killed President Muammar Gaddafi, who had provided an economic lifeline to the poorer countries of Africa. Now civil war rages in Libya, spilling over into the countries of the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Sudan. Crisis grips these countries and others across Africa, but U.S. leaders don't really mind collateral damage. They have bitten off more than they can chew. The endless mess caused by 3 decades of endless war helps to explain the problem facing Biden, Blinken, and their NATO allies, as well as Netanyahu. They have bitten off far more than they can chew. As they face defeat in their proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, a defeat they disguise as a stalemate, they are hoping for an easy solution of the Palestine-Israel conflict, one that could maintain the status quo ante, as if nothing serious has happened as a result of the current genocidal slaughter. It's a false hope. Palestine's allies in Yemen and Malaysia closed off the most crucial choke points of world commerce following the U.S. veto of the UN Security Council's ceasefire resolution in December 2023. The Yemeni position is clear, a spokesperson of Ansar Allah, also known as Houthis, told the New York Times. Attacks on ships in the Red Sea will stop when the Israeli war on the people of Gaza stops, they said. If the U.S. directly attacks Yemen, it could turn the war in Gaza into an international conflagration, the Houthi representative warned. Malaysia announced a ban on all Israeli-flagged cargo ships from docking at its port in the Strait of Malacca in response to Israel's actions that ignore basic humanitarian principles and violate international law through continuous massacres and atrocities against the Palestinians. So while the oil-rich Arab monarchies have yet to cut off Israel's oil supplies, shipments to Israel of oil and other cargo have slowed to a trickle. Meanwhile, intense diplomatic activity has continued, both at the UN in New York and in Cairo, to at least provide humanitarian aid to Gaza, if not a ceasefire. The U.S. threatened to veto any call for a suspension of hostilities, and Israel insisted on controlling and inspecting all cargo entering Gaza, which has left hundreds of trucks stalled at the border between Egypt and Gaza. The UN Secretary General's spokesperson said an immediate humanitarian ceasefire would be the most helpful thing for the delivery of humanitarian aid in a sustained high volume. The U.S. has provided the bombs and other munitions for the Israeli massacre in Gaza. Building for peace. Pressure is building for a genuine ceasefire, a permanent one based on justice for Palestine. The streets are full of protests almost everywhere. For the first time in decades, many labor unions in the U.S. have called for a ceasefire, and union members and organizers have hit the streets by the thousands in both New York and California. December 16th and thousands more in New York, December 22nd. Labor for Palestine was the main organizer, with strong support from the United Auto Workers, American Postal Workers Union, the United Electrical Workers, California and National Nurses Association, United Food and Commercial Workers, National Education Association, Service Employees Union, International Longshore and Warehouse Union, Unite Here, Association of American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and others. Teachers' unions, including the Chicago Teachers Union, the San Antonio Alliance of Teachers and Support Professionals, and the Massachusetts Teachers Association, were early signers of a ceasefire solution spearheaded by UE and UFCW. Workers have a special ability to stop Israeli genocide, said Michael Letwin of Labor for Palestine. If workers refuse to load or unload Israeli Zimline ships, that's worth 1,000 resolutions, he said. Letwin is the former president of the United Auto Workers Local 2325, the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys. The new UAW president, Sean Fain, said, "We take pride in our history of standing up for justice at home and around the world. I thank our UAW members for speaking out and pushing us to come out in support of a ceasefire," he said. UAW Region 9A Director Brandon Mancia declared November 30th outside the White House, where protesters were on hunger strike, "I'm proud today to announce that the UAW International has joined the call for a ceasefire in Israel and Palestine. From opposing fascism in World War II to mobilizing against apartheid South Africa and the Contra War, the UAW has consistently stood for justice across the globe. A labor movement that fights for social and economic justice for all workers must always stand against war and for peace. Jewish groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, Not in Our Name, and If Not Now, have organized numerous disruptive protests, shutting down a highway in Los Angeles as well as Grand Central Station and 3 major bridges in New York. Zuccotti Park, the scene of the Occupy movement a decade ago, filled on December 28th in a protest organized by Within Our Lifetime, a Palestinian community group that has led numerous protests. The Shut It Down for Palestine coalition has maintained weekly and even daily actions in large and small cities across the country. The coalition includes the Palestinian Youth Movement, National Students for Justice in Palestine, Al-Auda, Answer, People's Forum, International People's Assembly, and many other local groups. Demands include an immediate ceasefire, cutting all U.S. aid to Israel, and lifting the siege of Gaza. The coalition is committed to keep building momentum and increase the pressure with more marches, walkouts, sit-ins, and other forms of direct action to end collaboration with Israeli genocide and occupation. The Adala Justice Project, a Palestinian-led advocacy organization, mobilized more than 80 community-based advocacy groups to de-link anti-immigrant repression and money for war in Gaza and Ukraine. They issued a joint statement against a deal Biden offered to send billions to Israel and Ukraine in exchange for a draconian anti-immigrant bill. Hundreds of activists occupied the Capitol Rotunda, where they sang and chanted slogans including "Not in Our Name," and held signs reading "Stop Arming Israel" and "Protect Immigrants and Asylees." Code Pink has also staged numerous disruptions in Congress and called a national march on Washington for Gaza on January 13, 2023. together with a coalition of numerous Muslim and Palestinian groups and hundreds of local and national anti-war groups. That was in January 2024. Code Pink recognizes Palestinians as the rightful owners and caretakers of Palestine, their indigenous homeland. We support Palestinians' right to resist the violent Israeli occupation of Palestine, they say. We are committed to supporting Palestinian liberation, using the demands of Palestinians as our guideline for organizing, and we endorse the BDS movement to boycott, disinvest, and sanction Israeli apartheid. The protest and the news from Gaza have had impact. A December 19, 2023 New York Times report said voters broadly disapprove of the way President Biden is handling the bloody strife between Israelis and Palestinians, with younger Americans far more critical than older voters of both Israel's conduct and the administration's response to the war in Gaza. Global pressure for peace. While the U.S. tries to bolster Israel as its proxy in the Middle East, the majority of countries in the world are looking for a different solution. The Arab League and Organization of Islamic States met in late 2023 to call for a ceasefire and pursue joint action. This Arab Islamic summit represents 79 countries, over half the global South. They met together with China, whose 5-point peace proposal on Israel-Palestine was launched at the UN Security Council to coincide with the UN's International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on November 30th, 2023. China calls for a comprehensive ceasefire, effective protection of civilians, ensuring of humanitarian assistance, diplomatic mediation, and an emergency international conference as soon as possible to forge a political settlement. China says the root cause of the problem is the long delay in realizing the dream of an independent state of Palestine and the failure to redress the historical injustice suffered by the Palestinian people. On December 29, 2023, South Africa filed a case against Israel before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, charging genocidal acts against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Where this can lead is uncertain, but it forces the UN system to grapple with Israel and the US, who are facing total global isolation. Israel remains determined to crush the Palestinian resistance and expel Palestinians from their land once and for all, and has wholehearted support in Washington. Their heads are stuck in a racist status quo mindset by which they can somehow decide how Palestinians should be governed. But as Khaled El-Gindi wrote in a December 18, 2023 Foreign Affairs article, Israeli and U.S. officials will need to reconcile themselves to the fact that Hamas will, in one form or another, remain a force in Palestinian politics. The author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump, Caligny, adds that U.S. and Israeli officials must abandon the idea that they can re-engineer Palestinian politics to suit Israeli or U.S. political needs, a conceit that has helped erode the domestic legitimacy of Palestinian leaders since the Oslo process began in 1993. A new global situation. The crisis in Israel-Palestine follows on the heels of U.S. and NATO failure in their proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. The New World Order that George Bush Sr. announced after the Soviet Union's collapse is now showing cracks. U.S. and NATO planners are slowly awakening from their dream of weakening Russia through a proxy war in Ukraine. At his hastily arranged visit to Washington December 11, 2023, Ukrainian President Zelensky did not get a congressional standing ovation as he had a year earlier, and he did not get a commitment for more billions. Joe Biden pressed hard for the money, declaring the U.S. should take pride that we've enabled Ukraine's success thanks to the steady supply of weapons and ammunition we've provided them. Biden really did say success, and then warned of American troops fighting Russian troops if Russia attacks a NATO ally. Biden's warning caused a reaction that might have led to a White House walkback of his reckless remarks. Instead, his strategic communications director, John Kirby, repeated them the next day. He said, "If you think the cost of supporting Ukraine is high now, just imagine how much higher it's going to be, not just in national treasure, but in American blood, if he starts going after one of our NATO allies." Meanwhile, Hungary blocked proposed new aid to Ukraine from the European Union. The cost in lives and treasure of its endless wars has not bothered the U.S. leadership ever. In a real sense, the question now is what will it look like when they lose, as they are in Ukraine and as they most likely will in Palestine, as U.S. Defense Secretary General Lloyd Austin has predicted. The Palestinian resistance and the massive solidarity it has inspired are sapping confidence in both Washington and Tel Aviv. Austin said skepticism grows over Israel's ability to dismantle Hamas. That was the headline in the New York Times, December 27, 2023. Critics both within Israel and outside have questioned whether resolving to destroy such a deeply entrenched organization was ever realistic, the article says. At a December 26th Beirut press conference, Hamas leader Osama Hamdan said the decision-maker is the Palestinian people alone. They are not literally alone, of course. Support for Palestine has mushroomed everywhere. Chris Hedges says the global mystique of the U.S. after 2 decades of disastrous wars in the Middle East and the assault on the Capitol on January 6th is as contaminated as its Israeli ally. The Biden presidency, which ironically may have signed its own political death certificate, is tethered to Israel's genocide. It will try to distance itself rhetorically, but at the same time it will funnel the billions of dollars of weapons demanded by Israel. It is a full partner in Israel's genocide project, Hedges said. Meanwhile, there's China. While crises in Gaza and Ukraine have continued to dominate headlines, China still holds top spot on the U.S. enemies list. Roger Harris, a member of the U.S. Peace Council's Executive Committee, visited China with a 2023 Peace Council delegation that met with the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament. Harris says the U.S. is preparing for war with China. High-ranking U.S. Air Force General Michael Minahan foresees war as early as 2025. Harris notes that China is surrounded by a ring of some 400 U.S. military bases. Biden has strengthened the Quad military alliance with India, Australia, and Japan, originally initiated in 2007. The AUKUS security pact with the UK and Australia, founded in 2021. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing with UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, dating back to the beginning of the First Cold War. And it has forged a new mini-NATO alliance with Japan and South Korea last August. That's last August 2023. Chinese President Xi Jinping has said how China and the U.S. get along will determine the future of humanity. China wants friendly cooperative relations based on mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, as opposed to the U.S. winner-take-all approach. Following the official U.S. national security doctrine of full-spectrum dominance, the RAND Corporation, the Pentagon's think tank, recently completed a study which says it all: War with China, thinking through the unthinkable. The outcome, they predicted, would be disastrous for both sides. That may be an optimistic assessment for the U.S. war planners. Ajamu Baraka, chair of Black Agenda for Peace, was also part of the U.S. Peace Council delegation. he shared the definition of peace from the black radical peace tradition. He said, "Peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy." This is the kind of peace we need, not a continued Pax Americana imposed as U.S. global hegemony. Failure upon failure, globally and at home, is causing a cascade of disasters, not only for the Biden administration, but for the whole U.S. elite and for the world of its victims. The one positive factor is that the Palestinians have awakened a determination for peace and solidarity across the world, and even in the United States. But it will take continued effort to make peace and solidarity a dream that can come true. That was written on January 1st, 2024. Continuing the introduction from May 1st, 2023, Snatching War from the Jaws of Peace. The first proposal to end the Ukraine-Russia conflict was agreed in principle by both sides in late March 2022, about a month after Russian forces entered the Donbass region. But Britain's then Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Kiev to scuttle that deal. He told Ukraine's President Zelensky the collective West wasn't ready for the war to end, and Putin cannot be negotiated with, end quote. Just before the leaders of Russia and Ukraine agreed in principle to that first peace accord, Joe Biden said on March 26, 2022, that this battle will not be won in days or months either. We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead. In a June 1st, 2022 op-ed in the New York Times, Biden wrote, "I will not pressure the Ukrainian government, in public or private, to make any territorial concessions." End quote. He did not say if the U.S. would exert pressure against such concessions, which would surely be required for talks to start. Neither the Russian government nor the people of the Donbass, Crimea, and nearby areas are likely to accept the terror that was imposed on Russian speakers in Ukraine from 2014 to 2022. China's top diplomat, State Councilor Wang Yi, told the delegates at the Munich Security Conference in February 2023, "It is imperative to return to the Minsk II agreement as quickly as possible. That would mean a ceasefire and autonomy for the Donbass and getting NATO out of Ukraine." Wang said Minsk II is a binding instrument negotiated by the parties concerned and endorsed by the UN Security Council. Russia and the EU both support Minsk II. He claimed U.S. Secretary of State Blinken had expressed U.S. support. The Chinese diplomat called for the relevant parties to sit down together to work out a roadmap and timetable for implementation of the agreement. War hysteria versus mass revulsion to war. The first year of the Ukraine conflict was gripped by nearly unprecedented war hysteria, remarkable in a country that has experienced nearly continuous war hysteria for generations. The memories of mainstream media publishing major exposures of U.S. war crimes like the 1969 My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the infamous Pentagon Papers that blew the lid off Washington's hopeless misadventures are faded blips on a distant radar screen. But they are reminders of the power of an aroused wave of anti-war protest that swept American society during the U.S. war in Vietnam. It was powerful enough to make all sectors in the society take notice and ultimately helped the Vietnamese force the U.S. to stop the war. It fostered the Vietnam Syndrome, a mass revulsion to war and war propaganda that put the brakes on the war machine, at least for a while. It can happen again, and it needs to. Over the week marking Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, January 13th to 22nd in 2022, protests surged across the country to stop U.S. wars. major national coalitions joined forces to hit the streets of New York and more than 90 other cities. A March 18th national mobilization in Washington, D.C. was much larger, with echoes in other cities across the country. Margaret Kimberly of Black Agenda for Peace spoke at both the New York rally and a Harlem speak out to stop racism, poverty, and World War III. She denounced NATO as a cabal of white supremacists, waging war not only against Russia and China, but the peoples of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. John Parker, former peace and freedom candidate for the California State Senate and national leader of the Socialist Unity Party, gave eyewitness testimony from the Donbass, where he visited in May 2022. He said U.S.-funded Ukrainian fascists committed war crimes that were later blamed on Russia by Western media. He pointed to a direct connection between the Ukrainian fascists and the May 14th mass shooting of 10 black people in Buffalo, New York. The killer described himself as a supporter of white supremacy, inspired by Ukraine's neo-Nazi Azov battalion. Sarah Flounders of the United National Anti-War Coalition said UNAC called protests in more than 90 cities. Across the country, people are beginning to mobilize and speak out against the billions and billions for a new war, she said. Just weeks after the U.S. got out of Afghanistan, they had a new war prepared, and that war was years in the planning, long before the 2014 fascist coup. It was for one reason only, to bring in a fascist grouping to threaten Russia, to bomb Russia and the Russian population of Ukraine, to expand NATO. Flounders added, now they're doing the same thing against China. Japan has just doubled its military budget. It will soon be the third largest military power, in alliance with the U.S. for war on China. In these wars, the Democratic and Republican parties are together, she said. There's one war party. It's only people's movements from below, the grassroots movement, that's going to stop them. So no to NATO, stop all U.S. war, she concluded. The New York March ended with a teach-in at the People's Forum, where Eugene Poirier of Breakthrough News said that when the government and liberals blame Russia for the war in Ukraine, it marginalizes any resistance to U.S. and NATO actions by setting up a framework that puts any anti-escalation or anti-sanctions arguments on the back foot by framing Russia as the aggressor. Brian Becker, a director of the Answer Coalition, said at the People's Forum teach-in that it's quite clear the U.S. is not going to stop the war. It has no intention of negotiating a deal with Russia, but Russia is determined not to lose because this is an existential war. If it were to lose, it would be broken up, like Yugoslavia and the USSR. The U.S. would like to break up Russia and China so they won't have to face great powers. Becker added, when Biden et al. Talk about a Green New Deal, their actual policy is the opposite because they need to produce more oil, both in the U.S. and abroad. So if you care about climate change, this is another reason to oppose this war. If you care about the human family, you need to oppose this war. We're in the beginning of a very big project, Becker continued. When Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat in the mid-1950s, she didn't know she was launching the civil rights movement. He noted that the militant anti-war struggle won in the face of far-right electoral victories in 1968, when Wallace won 5 states and Nixon 35. It was the intensity of the anti-war and civil rights movements that forced the government to concede in spite of far-right electoral victories, he said. Dr. King sparked an escalation of the anti-war movement with his historic April 4, 1967 speech at New York's Riverside Church, when he declared, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world is my own government. I cannot be silent." King also denounced a triple-pronged sickness that has been lurking within our body politic from its very beginning. That is the sickness of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism. Today, the peace movement needs the leadership and prophetic voice King provided, and the elemental force of the civil rights movement he led in the 1950s and 60s. Big lies. The government learned important lessons from its failure to suppress the historic movements of the 60s, despite massive repression, and it gradually revived the traditional U.S. war spirit. Ronald Reagan famously declared, "America's back," following the glorious 1983 invasion of tiny Grenada with a population of 110,000 to stop a revolution in our backyard. Joe Biden again said America's back in his first post-election victory lap to Europe in early 2021. In March 1991, after terror bombing Iraq, George H.W. Bush Sr. declared, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnamese syndrome once and for all." The Vietnam syndrome, once and for all. 12 years later, Bush Jr. declared mission accomplished after his theatrical landing on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln on May 1, 2003. The specter of Iraq's fabled weapons of mass destruction had been vanquished in an orgy of mass self-delusion. The secret of success for the war planners was mass deceit, brazen use of the big lie to cover the true nature of the government's misadventure and harness mass consent. It is now the weapon of choice for Biden and his neocons in waging the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia and Israel's genocide in Palestine. But deceit is not enough. It's combined with a war against disinformation, designed to suppress anything but the official narrative. Inspired by the torture and imprisonment of whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, this war makes it a crime to tell the truth. The whistleblowers have been condemned as terrorists, with the resulting fear effectively silencing journalists across the Western mainstream media. An important byproduct is self-censorship among anti-warriors, with a substantial sector denouncing vocal criticism of the official narrative. In April 2022, progressives in Congress quietly retracted a mild letter to Biden suggesting negotiation to stop the war. Instead, progressive leader Pramila Jayapal met with Biden at the White House. Protesters have been called Putin puppets for highlighting the dominant presence of U.S.-backed neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But it has been impossible to suppress memories of the State Department's Victoria Nuland blurting "fuck the EU" in early 2014 while handpicking the U.S. choice for president of Ukraine on orders from then Vice President Biden. Military breakdown. U.S. soldiers were a major factor in stopping the U.S. war machine during the Vietnam era. A Marine colonel wrote at the time that the U.S. military had broken down in Vietnam as soldiers refused to fight and combat veterans marched in protest after coming home. Sailors shut down ships that had been ordered to the war zone. Many bomber crews refused to go on raids into Vietnam after witnessing at least 30 giant B-52s crash after they were shot down. Units of the Army's 101st Airborne Division have been stationed in Poland and Romania alongside about 70,000 active duty U.S. troops in the rest of Europe. To date, there have been no reports of U.S. troops deserting or refusing duty in Europe, or of European anti-war groups reaching out to them. Such activity was common during the Vietnam era and during the endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. As of early 2023, about 375,000 U.S. soldiers, sailors, and air personnel were stationed in East Asia surrounding China or on warships patrolling the South and East China Seas. The largest concentrations are in Okinawa and South Korea. They are bolstered by more than 600,000 regular South Korean Army forces, operationally controlled by the U.S., and a suddenly resurgent Japanese military force. U.S. U.S. nuclear missile batteries are stationed in both countries, trained to target China and Russia. There is constant civilian protest against these forces in both Japan and Korea. Anti-war groups there often reach out to U.S. military personnel, encouraging them to demand to be sent home. Roughly 100,000 soldiers and family members are stationed in Hawaii, which is frequently used as a transit point between the U.S. mainland and the Asian theater. In 1969, there was a large and significant sanctuary struggle in Honolulu. Soldiers demanded a Bill of Rights and sought sanctuary in local churches. The protest impacted the war planners and soldiers themselves and their civilian supporters. Key organizers were the American Servicemen's Union, ASU, and religious anti-war activists, similar to the GI resistance movement in mainland USA. There were hundreds of GI resistance coffee houses near bases across the U.S., in Europe, and in Asia. Many of these support centers developed their own underground presses, publishing leaflets and newspapers encouraging active duty people to resist. Worldwide Chorus urgently calling for peace in Ukraine. Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies reported in late October 2022 on calls for peace from UN Secretary General Guterres, Pope Francis, and leaders of 66 countries who were speaking at the UN General Assembly in September 2022, representing the majority of the world's population. They also highlighted former U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union Jack Matlock, who wrote an October 17th article in Responsible Statecraft titled, "Why the U.S. Must Press for a Ceasefire in Ukraine." The ambassador said the United States is obligated to find a way out of this crisis. The article concluded, "Until the fighting stops and serious negotiations get underway, the world is headed for an outcome where we all are losers." End quote. Biden says, in March 2022, President Biden said this battle will not be won in days or months. We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead. In May, he said he was doing everything within my power to address Putin price hikes. Margaret Kimberly, editor of Black Agenda Report, wrote that Joe Biden and his foreign policy team of incompetent ideologues hope to convince Americans to accept food shortages, rising gas prices, and the risk of a hot war. The steady diet of dangerous nonsense is a necessity for them. The game is up if the people begin to question what they're being told. The average person may not be well versed in the history of U.S. policy towards Russia, but they know when things don't add up. Rambling, incoherent speeches punctuated by shouts of war criminal and genocide don't cut it when working people can barely afford to put gas in the tank. End quote. In a June 1st, 2022 op-ed in the New York Times, Biden insisted, "We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia." Instead, he said the flood of new weapons, ammunition, and billions of dollars is meant to help Ukraine be in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. With strong U.S. support, Ukrainian President Zelensky has insisted on a status quo ante, meaning Russian troops leaving all the areas they have occupied. Neither the Russian government nor the people of the Donbass, Crimea, and nearby areas can be expected to give up the gains achieved in the war. A path to protracted conflict. In late December 2022, retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor wrote that the U.S. refusal to acknowledge Russia's legitimate security interests in Ukraine and negotiate an end to this war is the path to protracted conflict and human suffering. Inside the Biden administration, there is growing concern that the Ukrainian war effort will collapse under the weight of a Russian offensive. He cited an Economist interview in which Ukraine's Armed Forces Chief General Valery Zaluzhny admitted Russian mobilization and tactics are working. Ukrainian forces might be unable to withstand the coming Russian onslaught. McGregor said the Biden administration's unconditional support for the Zelensky regime in Kiev is reaching a strategic inflection point not unlike the one LBJ reached in 1965. Just as LBJ suddenly determined in 1964 that peace and security in Southeast Asia was a vital U.S. strategic interest, the Biden administration is making a similar argument now for Ukraine. Like South Vietnam in the 1960s, Ukraine is losing its war with Russia, he concluded. Faced with this grim scenario, McGregor predicts Biden will soon repeat LBJ's performance in 1965, proposing not a NATO attack on Russia, but instead a U.S.-led coalition of the willing to establish the ground equivalent of a no-fly zone. But McGregor says NATO's governments are divided in their thinking about the war in Ukraine. Except for Poland and possibly Romania, none of NATO's members are in a rush to mobilize their forces for a long, grueling war of attrition with Russia in Ukraine. No one in London, Paris, or Berlin wants to run the risk of a nuclear war with Moscow. Americans do not support going to war with Russia, and those few who do are ideologues, shallow political opportunists, or greedy defense contractors. End quote. The edge of nuclear catastrophe. The world is on the edge of nuclear catastrophe because of the failure of Western political leaders to be forthright about the causes of the escalating global conflicts, declared Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University professor and director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He said the relentless Western narrative that the West is noble while Russia and China are evil is simple-minded and extraordinarily dangerous. It is an attempt to manipulate public opinion, not to deal with the very real and pressing diplomacy. There is only one country whose self-declared fantasy is to be the world's dominant power, Sachs continued. It's past time the U.S. recognized the true sources of security, internal social cohesion and responsible cooperation with the rest of the world, rather than the illusion of hegemony. With such a revised foreign policy, he continued, the U.S. and its allies would avoid war with China and Russia and enable the world to face its myriad environment, energy, food, and social crises. Sachs added that European leaders should pursue the true source of European security, not U.S. hegemony, but European security arrangements that respect the legitimate security interests of all European nations, certainly including Ukraine, but also including Russia. Europe should reflect on the fact that the non-enlargement of NATO and the implementation of the Minsk II agreements would have averted this awful war in Ukraine. The fundamental question is, what will it take to get the U.S. government to stop pouring means of war, money, weapons, mercenaries, and its NATO allies into Ukraine? An all-sided and massive anti-war movement will be required that does not depend merely on moral suasion or the enlightened words of illustrious sages. Only if there is a gigantic upsurge of opposition determined to stop business as usual will it be realistically possible to bring peace. Anti-war forces must directly challenge the big lie official narrative and unite with all who want to save the planet and oppose the onset of fascism. That introduction was released on May 1st, 2023.